we've been studying figures of speech across different languages, across more than 2 millennia. And so it's not surprising that we know a lot about what works for figures of speech, and we have a lot of different figures that we use. The basic principles are you have key moments in a speech where you want to craft sentences that are really powerful. Primacy effect, where your first sentence obviously is going to be important to do attention getting, but also it sets the tone. Recency effect, it's usually powerful to end a speech with a sentence that's memorable, keeps attention, and condenses into a single sentence as much of your meaning as you can get by with. Those are usually also, not coincidentally, the places that media will pick up on. And so if you're wanting to get your word out on television, you've got roughly 15 seconds in which to make your impression. And you want to be able to predict both what of your longer interview will be used, and you want to be able to pack as much into those 15 seconds. And so that means crafting sentences with power. And that means usually using figures of speech. Some of the figures of speech are going to be very familiar to you. We've been studying metaphor probably since high school, and metaphor is one of those figures of speech. Other principles for the figures of speech rely on things like repetition. So for example, we can think of a lot of quotes, memorable quotes, that start with a repetition of the same phrase. Classic example, Winston Churchill, World War II. We shall fight in the air, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight and we shall never give up. Memorable quote, hugely influential with Britain in the war. One of the things you notice about that quote is the repetition of that initial phrase. This is what we call a figure of speech named anaphora. And all the figures of speech have funny Greek names because those were the first folks to start systematically studying how do we do sentences that pack this kind of punch. So an anaphora, repetition of a phrase at the beginning, is a really easy way to construct powerful sentences. Just think about what it is that you want to have that primacy effect, that first piece, and then craft the different endings. And then oftentimes it's also interesting to end that last repetition with a twist so that you come up with something varied. And you can actually sit yourself down and craft this kind of sentence very rapidly, very systematically. So you think, what's your stem going to be? We shall fight. Another example, also coming from Winston Churchill, famous quote. About victory, because without victory there is no survival. And so the repeating is that victory, and then what there is after it. You can see this across sentences as well. Martin Luther King, I have a dream that one day we shall. Same principle, it's also an example of anaphora. We can flip it around. Sometimes the best thing to do is not to repeat at the beginning. Let me finish diagramming that. So what you're repeating is, we shall fight. So that's taking advantage of primacy effect. We can take advantage of recency effect, and instead of repeating the beginning part, repeat the last part. One of the famous examples of this is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address uses this repetition at the end position. The name for this is called epistrophe. No, I'm not expecting you to guys actually remember the different names. They are available, though, if you ever get interested. But thinking through the principle of it and being able to do this for your topics. So the phrase that's important is the people, right? That's how the Gettysburg Address ends. So that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Really simple. You can do this with any topic, and it's going to have that ringing effect. Sometimes instead of repetition, what you want is contrast. So I had mentioned the power of establishing a pattern and then the last one varies from that, like with "we shall fight and we shall never give up." Similarly, sometimes it's best to build a sentence directly around this concept of contrast. Pick two words, any two words that are opposites.
Black and white.
Good. Take any pair of antonyms, and we can construct around that a sentence. And this type of figure of speech is called antithesis. We use that word in regular speech as well. So we're going to contrast. My speech is going to be about technology transfer. And we're going to construct a sentence around the And I've just come up with an antithesis arguing in favor of the Open Commons argument as a way of handling intellectual property. And for those of you that are interested in things like Linux, for example, is an open source software for the most part. And it's roughly the same length on both sides, you'll notice. We notice that in both cases, the phrases, the opposite words are compacting together to more directly contrast these longer phrases. It's still fairly short. It'll stay within my 15-second limit for the news. In an ideal world, what you'd really want to do is pack your words even more closely together, because the more strongly your opposites are slammed together, it's like a mental paradox. Your audience is forced to stop and process, okay, so I've got a pair of opposites. How are they being reconciled in this position, right? And so these direct contrasts. So classic example, Adlai Stevenson was giving a eulogy for Eleanor Roosevelt. While others cursed the dark, she lit a candle. And you may be familiar with that quote. It's a fairly famous eulogy. And notice that what we're doing in that one, we have the opposites, dark and light, slammed right back against each other with only that word she balancing between the two of them. One of the other things that you might not notice about this lovely quote, one of the other reasons why it becomes such a powerful, easily remembered quote, is the repetition of that C sound. That's a fairly harsh sound. And we talk about the ways in which you can set the tone of your sentence by the sound of the syllables themselves. But this should be highlighting to you another very familiar figure of speech. And maybe you can remember back to your high school days where you talked about alliteration. Alliteration is best used in moderation, tells you another figure of speech that we can use in speeches for memorable sentences. It starts sounding really sing-songy, and that's why we use it for children's books a lot of the time. But in moderation, it's oftentimes one of the signs in conversation as well, that conversation is going well. If you listen to two people who are very deeply immersed in their conversation together, one of the things you can pick up on is that oftentimes you'll start hearing repetition of words across different speakers, right? Because we're dealing with the same topic, that makes sense. But you'll also start hearing sounds, the same syllables, the same letters start coming up more often. And it's statistically significant if you track it over a long time. And so it is one of those signs in both speech and conversation. It's easy to construct an alliteration. You pick your topic, and it's almost inevitable that it starts coming out. So for example, it's easy for me to think about technology transfer because of that alliteration. There are lots of famous quotes that take advantage of alliteration. The only thing is, do remember not to overdo it. So another more complicated figure of speech, kind of probably the last one maybe the last one I'll go over for now. Instead of a simple direct contrast like an antithesis sentence does, or instead of a simple repetition like an aphora or epistrophe will do, one can have a series so that you'll get a building effect, where it's neither simple comparison nor simple contrast, but actually a development across a series of three. So to do this, you need at least 3 items in your C-group series. So slightly longer sentences usually, or developed across 2 sentences or 3 sentences. You also need a series of 3 that has an obvious and natural progression. So, back to Churchill quotes from World War II. Seems to be the theme. Churchill has a fairly famous quote. He who controls Berlin controls Germany. He who controls Germany controls Europe. He who controls Europe controls
the world.
Of course it's the world. You knew where that sentence was going. You knew that sentence even if you hadn't heard Churchill's actual quote before, although Churchill's quote is fairly memorable. It's also very powerful. Because you knew where that sentence was going before I arrived there, you knew exactly what the conclusion was. That conclusion was your conclusion before it was mine. You didn't have to wait for me to have figured out that conclusion. And because it's the audience's own thought process that gets them there, it's persuasive. They own it in a way other than if I had had to hand that conclusion to them. The logic has a feeling of inevitability to it. And indeed, that argument was one part of what got the United States, into the war. We needed a further prompt, granted. But that argument had a lot of weight to it. This is called, by the way, a climax or scala. Scala for scale, the musical note progression. And so anything that has that sense of progression. Constructing a scala is a little bit harder than constructing an antithesis because, as I said, you need to think of something that has that natural progression. Places where we often see that happening. Seasons. The seasons have an inevitability to them. And so we find easily memorable and we find strongly persuasive arguments about, for example, in the summer of young love, it's easy. In the winter of our old age, it's harder to sustain a relationship. And so there's this sense of an inevitability to that progress. The audience very quickly is able to persuade themselves that they see the logic of it, that they came to that conclusion. We can see that progression sometimes based on cultural knowledge. So, this has received mixed reviews from my students of late, but one of the things that many of us grew up on was the Dick and Jane books. And so it was very natural, see Dick do this, see Dick do this, right? See Dick do this. It was therefore a very powerful drunk driving commercial, anti-drunk driving commercial, when we came up with that series, See Dick Drink. And perhaps you can fill in the last blank from that scala, that progression.
Die.
There's a sense of inevitability to it that works with students only if they have either some knowledge of this commercial series, which ran for a very long time on television, this series of public service announcements, or if they'd read the actual Dick and Jane books, or at least were familiar with those. And so as our culture shifts and students no longer learn how to read using the same set of texts, this becomes less powerful of a scala. We still use it. It's still deeply funny, and we recognize the humor of it when we do variations on that theme. And so one of the fun things to do with Scala is to come with a surprise ending. So instead of drive, there's t-shirts that make humorous statements. And it's funny because the substitution of dive instead of drive, for anybody who enjoys that kind of, water recreation, going scubaing, or even just going a little bit of swimming in not terribly deep water, and the rewards that can be earned that way. You go to some Bourbon Street. Can use it for a commercial, can use it for humor, t-shirts, things like that. All of those are working on the same principle, though, that what you're really trying to do with these figures of speech is you're gambling on what you know of audience psychology. Repetition, even repetition plus variation, works because the audience is able to preemptively figure out what you're doing. The form itself makes it easier for us to both remember, the novelty catches us, and the condensed information makes it so that we can encapsulate kind of the whole idea of a speech, ideally, into these little tiny nuggets. Other principles of novelty that we can do with figures of speech, things like inversion, where we put words in an unexpected order. Oftentimes what you want to do is put words in an unexpected order so that the most important words go first when they normally wouldn't. So, for example, Kennedy's sentence, "ask not." How do you normally say that?
Don't ask.
Right. We normally would have all these useless helper verbs and then the negating principle, and only then do we actually get to the meaning of this sentence. Kennedy inverts it. It's perfectly acceptable grammar to say ask not. It's just unexpected. And so that little inversion gains attention. One of the other things that's clever that he does in that sentence, ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you. Ask rather, right? So again, we have a tiny bit of anaphora, but we also have a tiny bit of an antithesis because he flips it, right? And so it's the opposite idea. Instead of asking country does for you, you do for country. So Kennedy has some really powerful quotes. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Again, it's an inversion, antithesis, sorry. It's also an inversion. It's taking our normal sentence order and changing it around to put things together, in this case, but them right up against each other in order to have maximum contrast. Things like putting phrases in the middle of a sentence in unexpected places so that you have novelty And so that it's drawing attention to this piece that you added in. That technique is called parenthesis. Inserting a phrase that interrupts the normal syntactical flow. And so, another Churchill quote, I'm just off on the Churchill quotes today. A man does what he must, in spite of personal consequence, in spite of dangers and obstacles. And that is the basis of all human morality. So you've got a whole lot of things in there, in the middle, interrupting the flow, forcing my audience to stop, and have to think about, okay, what is it that we started with, what is it that we ended with, and what is this obstacle in the middle that I have to contend with? And so, in the form of the sentence is echoing the point of the sentence. Anybody can do these things. These figures of speech don't necessarily require you to have like a memory of what the different names are, the different principles. It just requires sitting down and actually looking at or thinking through what is it that your sentence is doing. Our ancient practice of diagramming sentences was a really nice way of doing this because it forced you to see visually whether your sentence is balanced. In a perfect world, you want your sentence to come out roughly balanced, especially if you're doing something like antithesis, but with anaphora as well. Having those clauses be roughly the same length gives it extra power, especially if your last one is going to be something longer. You want that contrast. And then once you have that done, once you get good at crafting these sentences, it's really powerful because you know exactly what's going to be the most important part of your speech, the piece that gets called out on the news. It will stand out. It's got novelty. It's got a sense that the audiences are persuading themselves. And so it makes your task much easier if you're trying to get your voice out. Given our information overloaded society, being able to do this is really probably one of the most powerful things I can teach you. So give it a try. I'd like to get at least a couple examples, one antithesis, one either anaphora or antithesis or epistrophe, and one either inversion or scala. And I will look forward to hearing your sentences in your speeches. Thanks.